All right, hello again. We are going to talk about chapter 19 now, which is about surveys and sampling. And it's really important just because surveys happen a lot. We see them a lot. And so to fully understand like what makes a survey good or what makes a survey bad is very wise, right? Because we see them in social media and the news all the time. So the first things that I want to talk about, I'll try to make this as short as possible, but still trying to teach you something. Anyway, so the first thing I want to mention is what a population is, right? So population is just the entire set of existing units that you want to know about. So whether that's all students at a school or whether that's all adults in the US or whatever it is, that is the population. Now, a sample is when you just take a portion of that population, because the whole point of sampling is because we don't know about the population. We want to know about the population. So then we take these samples and we get information, and then that helps us to find out information about the entire population. All right, so parameter is just a number that describes something about the population. So whether that's height or age or, whatever it is we're wanting to know, okay? So parameter describes population. Those are linked, and that's nice because they both start with the same letter. And then statistic, which is a number that describes a sample characteristic, so that goes with sample. So parameter describes population, statistic describes a sample of people. So that's how you can remember those, because they start the same letter. So let's do an example of this. So we have a physician that thinks a certain gene might make a person slightly more susceptible to a skin disease. So in the general population, the gene occurs in 55% of people. So there's another important part right there. The physician takes a random sample of 300 people with this skin disease and finds that 196 of them have the gene. So for this problem, if I asked you, okay, define the population, what is the population? So it looks like the only information we have is just general population, right? Okay. Hey, come on in. I'll pause. Sorry about that. Had a visitor. Okay, so the population is just the general population, which I guess we can assume is everyone. It's not even saying in the whole world or US, but I'm assuming it's everyone. So then what's the parameter? So the parameter would be the number that we got from the population, right? So which number describes the population? Well, that would be this 55% of people have the gene, right? And then our statistic is going to be, sample and then statistic, my bad. Got the order mixed up. Okay, sample and then statistic. Okay, so our sample is the random sample of 300 people, right? And then the statistic is the 196 of them that have the gene. All right, so parameter describes the population, statistic describes the sample. So I want you to try this one. on your own, I'm going to pause this for a second, and if you need to pause it too, but I want you to identify population, the parameter, just going to abbreviate everything, sample, and statistic. Okay, sorry for the messy handwriting, but if you will just do this on your own, just to make sure you understand everything, and then we'll go from there. All right, so hopefully you've answered this. The population should be young mothers. Looks like that's what they're looking at. Not the old moms like me, just the young ones. Okay, and then the parameter would be what describes. So the magazine claims that the 50% of them have a hard time finding childcare. So that would be the 50%, would be the parameter. And then the sample they took is this simple random sample, 450. And then the statistic is that number out of their sample that said they had a hard time finding childcare. So hopefully that makes sense with just how to define population, parameter, sample, and statistic. All right, so I'm going to show you an example. That was actually the presidential election in 1936, is between FDR and Alfred Landon. And this company that did political polls, it was called the Literary Digest. Okay, what they did is they sent out 10 million questionnaires to people. That's a lot, right? And of course, in 1936, it's mail, it's snail mail is what we refer to it as now. But anyway, so they mailed them out, and then they published their results. So right before the election, which is in November, so October 31st, they published these results predicting Landon would win by about 14% more. But what do you notice about this number right here compared to how many they sent out? It's a lot less, right? So this is only about 2.2, 2.3 million out of the 10 actually responded and mailed it back. So that's how you don't take a sample, is if you post the results off of that many that did not answer or did not reply to your survey. So, and they were, they were quoted as saying they're hardly ever wrong and blah, blah, blah. I was going to show you the quotes on here, and then I decided not to. But anyway, so the actual results from the election were Roosevelt won by 62% and Landon was 38%. So after this happened, they actually went bankrupt because they, claimed that they were so accurate and they're not biased, but then they totally were. So that's an example of what not to do. So what went wrong is that those surveys were only mailed to people that were on some sort of list, whether it's a membership for a country club, or whether they had a vehicle registered, which, think of back then in 1936, those that had a vehicle were, their socioeconomic status is much different than people that did not have a vehicle, right? So when a selection procedure is biased like this one was, just because they had such a large sample size, they had a huge sample size, 10 million, right? But that just repeats that mistake even more. And then, like we mentioned, there were so many that did not respond. So that is referred to as non-response bias. If you send out surveys or ask a question and you don't get a response back. Because those that did not respond were probably those that voted for Roosevelt, right? So that is what went wrong in that 1936. So how do we fix it? How do companies, when they want to survey people and get information about a population, what should they do? So they should do simple random samples. That would be the ideal thing. Okay, if you did a simple random sample, that would be the best way to describe any sort of population. And what that means is basically so if they did this back then, every voter would be equally represented. So it doesn't matter if they owned a vehicle or if they were on any membership list, they would be represented. And then you draw from there without replacement until you get your sample size you want. And everyone has an equal chance of being selected. That's the important thing. So the advantages to this is that it's fair, right? Like you're not having any human error, like choosing who you want to survey. And everyone, like I said, has an equal chance of being selected or chosen. The law of averages guarantees that the percentage of Democrats or Republicans in the sample is going to be close to what's actually in the population. So what we've learned is no matter what the population is, if we sample random and large enough, it will approach what the population is. The thing is that it's not always possible, and it can be super expensive, and that's whether you're paying people to do it or whatever it is. It's just truly hard to get everyone in the population and randomly selecting that. So other ways to sample that are still random is what is called cluster sampling, and it's where you divide the population into these into these subgroups. So whether that's just purely by location or whatever it is, and then you randomly select a subgroup and you sample everyone in that group. So the example that I like to talk about is if you went to a jazz game. Funny that we're talking about that right now, but anyway, and they wanted to find out something about their fans. And what they could do is randomly select a section that's in Vivint, I think, randomly select, 3 sections, and then sample everyone in that section, right? And why would it be important to randomly select the section where they're sitting? Well, those up in the nosebleeds, may be different type of people than those closer, or you need that variety, right? And then samples of convenience, which this happens a lot. People just sample with what's convenient, whether that's like an online survey, or I'm sure you've received those annoying phone calls, whatever it is, that's just easy for them to do. Or you survey your close friends. Just know that when that happens, most of the time it's not random, most of the time. So there's that. So when you sample, there are types of bias, and bias is where it's right here. It's basically where it's directed in it's one direction or the other. So if you recall when we did the bridge measuring, like we watched that video of that guy on the bridge, and if you remember that, your bias in measuring that may have been you always ended too early, or you started too soon, or something like that. So all of your measurements may have been shorter than everyone else's, or it may have been longer than everyone else's. So that's what that means. So other sources of bias here is just like when questions are phrased in a leading way. Okay. If the questions are sensitive and they don't want to say the truth, and again, people can say things, but is that really what is happening? And then you have the volunteer response bias. This happens all the time. Okay, whether it's radio, TV, internet polls, everything like that. Usually, those that respond to those surveys feel strongly one way or the other about that, right? Um, so that this one happens a lot. So the other sorts of bias that can happen is selection bias, where you just leave out some part of the population. So if you're doing a phone survey and you're calling those that have a landline right now, then obviously you're going to leave out all of those that don't have landlines, right? Or there's the measurement bias, and that's just due to how you measure things, which is exactly what I was referring to with the bridge measurement that we did on that video. So when you are doing selection bias, so this is tied to this right here, okay? So there's groups like if you go around to homes to survey, then you have the homeless, you have those that are in hospitals that are not included. If you have those that just refuse to answer, right? Have you been one of those that if you get a phone call for a survey, you refuse to answer? Well, there's your non-response, right? And then the measurement bias goes here. So sometimes you have the interviewer can actually influence the response. So say you're asking a sensitive question and the interviewer, whatever, leads it in a way to where it will affect the response. Okay. And then how it's worded. There are sometimes surveys that are worded terribly, and that just gives you wrong results because it's not written in a clear manner. I'm going to show you an example of that in just a second. But the one thing that I forgot to mention is that you have probability samples and non-probability samples. So when the book refers to, well, is this a probability sample or is it not? Probability is like doing the simple random sample, right? So if you randomly assigned everyone a number and you randomly chose so many numbers, that would be that. Or the cluster sampling, that's random. So that includes some probability measure in it. Does that make sense? Whereas non-probability would just be, I'm going to sample the first 50 that walk in to the theater, whatever it is. Okay, I'm going to find that example that was really, really bad. Give me just a second. Okay, I found it. This was a question in 1993 sent out to people. Okay, this really did happen. So the question they asked is, does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? So that was the question they asked, and from that they had 22% respond that it seemed possible that it never happened, which at that time they were like, what? How is this right? There's no way. And so then they looked at that poll and was like, okay, they did something wrong. Obviously this question is worded completely terribly. So let's phrase it in a different way and see if we get different percentage of people that don't believe the Holocaust happened. Anyway, so they rephrased it to be this question. The term Holocaust usually refers to the killing of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps during World War II. In your opinion, did the Holocaust definitely happen, probably not happen, or definitely did not happen? So then they, had to choose one of these four things. But the question now was clear because it defined what Holocaust is referring to. what that term is referring to. And then they voted, of those 4 things, where do they stand? And so after that, only 4% said probably not or definitely did not happen, which is a lot less than 22%, right? And I'm pretty sure they were surveying people in the US because it was ran in the New York Times. So anyway, so that's an example of a terrible question which would create bias because it's worded completely bad. So anyway, hopefully this helps you to complete the Chapter 19 practice problems. You can take those twice for your highest score, and just let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.